Oh, I can't see myself. There we are. All right. Unit 2, obviously, we're still there talking about population and migration. Our topic 4 is population dynamics. And your objective for topic 4 is to explain factors that account for contemporary and historical trends in population growth and decline. I'm going to be honest, this topic we are going to talk a lot of terms, population terms, but also just factors that do affect population in general. Obviously, this is not an all-encompassing list of, every little thing that could affect population, but this is an overall general look at the factors that affect population. So if it's growing or declining or whatever. So changes in population are due to fertility, mortality, and migration, which are influenced by environmental, economic, cultural, and political factors. So, fertility, what is it? Geographers commonly use two different statistics to describe the rate at which children are born. That's what fertility is. It's the rate at which children are born. So you have the crude birth rate, which you will see labeled as CBR, which is the number of live births per year for each 1,000 people. And then you have the total fertility rate, which is the average number of children expected to be born to women in their childbearing ages, which is 15 to 49. So the crude birth rate is like what's happening now. The total fertility rate is like a prediction. So if women keep having children at this rate, like this is what our population can look like. Total fertility rate more accurately reflects cultural norms than crude birth rate, so you can tell more about what society values and what their culture is like if you study total fertility rate rather than just the crude birth rate. In most societies, the total fertility rate is between 2.1 and 2.4. That's the ideal fertility rate because it ensures that the population is growing, but will not exceed its carrying capacity. I'm sorry, there's another typo. There should be not right there. But the reason they want it to be between 2.1 and 2.4 is because theoretically, a couple would want to have 2 kids to replace themselves, right? So if every single couple had 2 kids, then the population would stay the same. But when you average it out, if it's 2.1 to 2.4, the population is growing, which is good for your country. You don't want your population to start declining. However, it's not growing too much or too fast. This is a map of overall fertility rate. You can tell the more developed countries have fewer children, where the more undeveloped countries have a lot more children. And that has to do with access to contraception and cultural norms as well. So we're going to look at a few factors that influence fertility rate and why these countries might have a high fertility rate or a low fertility rate. So social factors influencing fertility. Number 1, gender roles. It is worldwide empowered women, so women who are empowered and are empowered and accepted in going to college and finishing education and getting a job. Countries where that's normal, you're going to have lower fertility rates. It's also a trend that the more education a woman has, the lower the fertility rates are as well. And that's simply just because she's in school and she is going to college and then she gets a career, and whether or not, she plans like, okay, I'm not going to have kids until after, I'm done with all my schooling and I'm established in my job, or if it's just that she doesn't have time or anything like that. But it's a trend that the more education a woman has, or the more education women have in a certain society, the lower their fertility rates are. Another social factor that influences fertility is the acceptance of family planning. Family planning is choosing the number of kids that you have, and that is accomplished by using contraceptives, which are birth control. And there are several forms of birth control, um, but birth control and contraceptives aren't accepted in all cultures or societies. Um, that's even true of certain cultures within the United States. It's just not accepted, whether for religious reasons or whatever. And so, obviously, if you're not, um, participating in family planning, then your fertility rates are going to be higher because you're not preventing it. And then another social factor that influences fertility is societal marriage traditions. So in some societies, it is, traditionally women are going to marry young. Well, that means that they're going to be fertile longer, and so they're going to have more kids, which yields higher fertility rates. In countries where it's acceptable for women to, or in societies when it's acceptable for women to marry later, they're going to have lower fertility rates generally. Um, so those are the social factors that influence fertility. The cultural factors that influence fertility, religion. So, like we talked about contraceptives, there are certain religions that forbid birth control, or they really, really look down on the idea of birth control because, God should control that. Man should not. Not all religions think that, some do, and so that has an effect on fertility. And then ethnicity. Certain ethnic groups have large families because their culture ignites that. Like, that's just what their culture is. Like, you have a lot of children, that's just what you do. And so right here, you can see a chart of different ethnicities and their fertility rates. So, um, Hispanic families tend to have more children. Asian and Pacific Islander families tend to have less children. These are just trends based on, those ethnic groups and their culture. So those are cultural factors that influence fertility. Political factors that influence fertility. This gets kind of sketchy because this is, the government getting involved in your children. The government has a concern with how many kids you plan on having, because number one, they have to provide for them somewhat. Do they have enough resources? Is there enough capital? Can they defend these people? Different things like that. So countries will have pro-natalist policies or anti-natalist policies. Policies are government programs to encourage children to give birth. It is not children to give birth. I'm so sorry I said that. Government programs to encourage childbirths. So programs that governments implement because they want their people to be encouraged to have children. It's not as weird as it sounds. It's simply stuff like paid time off from jobs, free childcare, family discounts for government services, tax breaks, right? Like if you have more kids, you don't pay as many taxes, free college tuition, restrictions on birth control and abortions. So it's not like, countries are like, have more kids, but they're encouraging it usually through, um, economic means. Like if you have more kids, you don't pay as many taxes, and it's mandated that women have to get paid maternity leave or whatever when they have children. So they're just things that, hey, if I have a kid, this would be a nice incentive. So they don't discourage people from having children. Anti-natalist policies are a little more extreme. There's not as many examples of those because they're pretty extreme. But anti-natalist policies are government programs to decrease the number of births. So these are governments of countries that are like, hey, our population is growing way too fast. We can't really handle it. The most famous one of these policies is China's one-child policy, which was enacted between 1979 and 2016. So super recent. And China's population was growing too fast. Their government felt like, okay, you only need to have one child. This is a poster actually about a movie about the one child policy. You can watch it. It's on Amazon, I think. But um, China had to stop that policy because, births were so low that their population, they realized that eventually, when those kids start growing up, they're not going to be able to support the next generation. And so they don't want their population to start decreasing, and that's what it was doing. Also, because in China's culture, um, males are more valued than females, um, a lot of times if a family got pregnant with a girl, because they could only have one child, they would give that child up for adoption and try again for a boy. And so, because of that, the ratio between males and females was becoming way off, and they weren't even because people wanted male children. They did not want female children, so they would give them away, maybe leave them on the street, abort them. But so this policy caused all sorts of problems, but that's an extreme example of an antinatalist policy. All right, economic factors that influence fertility. Education and jobs, anything to do with that is going to be an economic factor. But like I said before, women with higher education and a job tend to have fewer children. And then child labor farms in rural poor areas tend to increase fertility rates. So those are just a couple examples of how education and jobs can affect fertility. Like I said, women who have more education, you can see in this chart, tend to have fewer children. But in places where children are needed to work, they will have more children. So the fertility rate will increase. Sorry about that. They came to clean my classroom, and I didn't want to be recording while they were spraying Lysol everywhere. Okay. I was just talking about the fertility rates when child labor is necessary. 100 years ago in the United States, when people were working farms, the reason they had so many kids was to work on the farm, um, because they needed those extra hands. So that is still true in a lot of developing countries that don't have the um, like the urbanization and the what's that word called? Industrialization. There we go. That we have in developed countries. So economic factors influencing fertility. Let's see what's next. All right, so we talked about fertility. We're now going to talk about mortality, which is the exact opposite. So fertility is births, mortality are deaths. Some terms here. Mortality rate is the number of deaths per year in a population per 1,000. Mortality rates provide insight into a country because it kind of tells you what they place values on. So you can study the infant mortality rate along with the regular mortality rate, which is the number of babies that die during the first year per 1,000 live births, and then the child mortality rate, which is the number of children who die before age 5 per 1,000 live births. These numbers reflect the overall health and access to proper nutrition. So you can see this map down here. The lighter the color, this is a chloropleth map. The lighter the color, the lower the, I think this is, infant mortality rate is. The darker the color, the higher the infant mortality rate is. So some cultural factors that influence mortality: seeking healthcare or using a home remedy to cure disease. So within this culture, is healthcare what people are looking for? And then, or, are they trying to cure diseases at home? Those are cultural factors. And then also access to healthcare. So is healthcare available to these places. So this is the map, global access to healthcare from 2017. The green countries is labeled as mature, so at mature systems, like good healthcare systems, ready to go, accepting lots of people. And then you can see the blue, and then it goes down to orange and red, which are um, emerging systems and then developing systems of healthcare. Political factors influencing mortality are, if government supports or funds healthcare for a society. And then conflicts and war between two states or slash countries, because we call states countries now. So obviously, that's a political decision, and it does influence mortality because it causes deaths. That's what this chart is. It's just the average number of deaths, conflict since 1946. You can see, if I move myself out of the way, you can see that our mortality rate worldwide through or because of war has drastically decreased. And most of the deaths today in wars are civil conflicts. So they're wars and conflicts within a single country. What else was I talking about? Oh, and then obviously if government supports or funds healthcare for society. So if government, if there's government funded healthcare and stuff like that, does affect mortality rate. Maybe not like you think it is going to, though. If you look here, economic factors influencing mortality. Again, access to high quality healthcare costs money. So that's why it's also an economic factor. Jobs that provide healthcare. So in the United States, we don't really have like state funded healthcare, but most jobs within the United States provide private healthcare insurance to their employees. So that's why it says economic systems. Do they support private insurance? Now, what I want to show you, interestingly enough, if you look at this map here, you will see that dark green is free and universal health care. Light green is universal health care, but it's not free. Blue is free, but not universal. And red is no free or no universal health care. You will see that the United States is in red because most of our health care is through private insurance. Now, if you look at this map over here, I'm so sorry, my family keeps texting me. If you look at this map, which is worldwide adult mortality of males in 2010, you will notice, interestingly enough, that countries, there are several countries that have no free or universal health care that have a really low mortality rate, whereas countries who have free and universal health care, their mortality rate is actually higher than a lot of countries without free or universal health care. A lot of that has to do with the concept of capitalism and competitors, but that's another topic for another day. I just thought that was an interesting thing to see side by side. So those are economic factors that influence mortality. The last thing we're going to talk about is I lied. I don't think it's the last thing, but the next to last thing is migration. So we talked about how fertility influences population, mortality. So births and deaths obviously change a place's population, but so does migration. So people moving there or people leaving there. So there are two types of migration. There's immigration and there's immigration. They're said the same way, but they're spelled different and they mean different things. So immigration with an E is leaving a location. So you immigrate with an E where you are leaving. You immigrate with an I where you're going. So immigration with an I is migrating to a new location. So if I were to leave the United States and move to Germany, I would be an E immigrant of the United States, but an I immigrant to Germany. Maybe that helps you understand it a little bit better. And then there are things called net migration. So net migration is the difference between the number of immigrants and the number of immigrants. So you're trying to figure out, do you have more people coming in or do you have more people leaving? So net in-migration means that the number of immigrants with an I exceeds the number of immigrants with an E. So net in-migration means we have more people coming in than we have going out. Net out migration is the opposite of that. So net out migration means, okay, we have more people leaving us than we have people moving in. A few things that influence migration, particularly culturally and politically. So cultural factors that influence migration, a lot of it is persecution. So religious persecution, ethnic persecution, cultural persecution. A lot of people leave places because they're being persecuted in some way. Political factors that influence migration tend to be conflicts or wars, and that's where you get refugees and asylum seekers. People tend to think they're the same thing. The difference is, though, that like refugees have permission to be somewhere, asylum seekers don't really have permission to be there, but they're trying to become a refugee. So, a refugee is a person who has been forced to leave their country in order to escape war, persecution, or a natural disaster. An asylum seeker is a person who fled their home country because of war or other factors harming them or their family, enters another country, and applies for asylum through the international protection, and they want the international protection of this country. Asylum seekers would be like we have like an immigration crisis right now where people are coming from Mexico into the United States as asylum seekers. They're not getting permission as a refugee, but they're just going ahead and crossing the border and applying for asylum especially because of like drugs and conflict regarding that in Mexico. So there are a lot of asylum seekers coming to the United States, which does increase our population. Last thing that we're going to go over is the fact that geographers use the rate of natural increase and population doubling time to explain population growth and decline. So we just talked about factors that can change the population rate. So, fertility adds to the population, mortality takes away from it, and then migration can add or take away from it. Now we're going to look at how geographers explain population growth and decline. So how they explain that with two terms. So rate of natural increase is a statistic that compares the birth rate and death rate of a country for population growth or decline. It measures the natural increase of a state through birth rates only. So the rate of natural increase is how the population is increasing without immigration or immigration. So natural births within the country is the population increasing. It's calculated by taking the crude birth rate, subtracting the crude death rate, and dividing it by 10. And then it's expressed as a percentage. So an example, if a country has a crude birth rate of 34.39 and a crude death rate of 17.89, its rate of natural increase is 34.39 minus 17.89 divided by 10, which gives us 1.65%. So the population is growing at 1.65%. That's an example. And then they also calculate population doubling time. So here we're figuring out, okay, how the various countries, how their population is going to increase naturally. This one's figuring out how long is it going to take this population to double. So this lets us know like how fast the population is growing compared to other places. So population doubling time is the amount of time it takes for a population in a given area to double. It's calculated using what is called the rule of 70. So it's 70 divided by the rate of natural increase is how you get the population doubling time. So for our rate of natural increase was 1.65%. 70 divided by 1.65 is 42.42. So roughly the population would double in 42 and a half years. Geographers use that again to compare it to other countries and kind of see how far into the future, they should be worried about sustaining a population. So this map down here is a map of population doubling times worldwide. The lighter the country, the longer it's going to take them to double their population. So either their population is declining or it's growing super, super slowly. And then the darker you get, the quicker your population is growing because the less time it's going to take to double. That is it for topic, I think this is 4 or 5. I don't remember. Sorry, but go ahead and do your summary at the bottom of your notes and answer the question at the bottom. Let me know if you have